Hi everyone, welcome to the latest edition of Sci-Fi, the show about the relationship between psychotherapy, psychoanalysis and politics. Really exciting episode, probably one of the best interviews I think I've done today with Mladen Dolar. I think perhaps the greatest philosopher of his generation, incredibly inspirational and influential philosopher who really brought the Slovene school into what it is today. Before we jump into that, coming to you from Ljubljana, so next week as well I'll be releasing an episode with Alenka Zupancic, so check back here next Friday for that. And just one quick thing I wanted to mention, one of our Sublation Media sponsors, GCAS, the Global Centre for Advanced Studies, is running a course. I'm actually teaching one myself on comedy and cancellation. So I've written about those things, comedy and cancellation culture, in the Sublation magazine recently. I'll put those links in the bio and the link to the GCAS courses if people are interested. So I'm going to jump in now to this discussion I had in Ljubljana this week with Mladen Dolar. We talked about, well, pretty much everything, the whole history of the Slovene school, the influence of psychoanalysis post-1968, and also the question of gossip and rumour, which is like Mladen's kind of recent topics, talking about a culture of gossip and rumour taking over from existing ideas of the master and of knowledge and so on. So, you know, Mladen, as I say, for me, is probably the single most inspirational philosopher, so I hope you all enjoy the episode, and thanks so much for listening.
So why don't we start with like your own history and like how you came to psychoanalysis in the first place, and what brought you to be this. You've dedicated what led you to dedicate like many years to the work on psychoanalysis?
Well, I can start with two anecdotes, personal stories, but they're also indicative of some larger signs of the times. And the first story is that the first time I was in Paris was in June 1969. I was a very young lad, and I was there with Alliance Française, with some organization, and they put us in dorms. And I missed the revolution, the May 68, by 1 year. But on that dorm where they put us in, there were still inscriptions. Paris was still covered by graffiti from 68. They couldn't remove this in 1 year. And on that particular dorm, there was this inscription, "Nous voulons jouir sans entrave," which is one of the famous slogans of 68, which means we want to enjoy without impediments, without hindrances. This was this was part of one part of the 68 setup, was this kind of go for the enjoyment.
Pursue pleasure.
There was the situationist, actually it was a situationist slogan. And the whole slogan was vivre sans temps mort, jouir sans entrave, to live without that time and enjoy without impediments. And well, you can see the sort of the ambiguity of these slogans, because they fit so well actually with the consumerist society. You know, no dead time. Let's enjoy without impediments. And so, at the time, of course, we thought, this is profoundly subversive, not quite realizing that this can be also interpreted in this other way. You know, that it can play into the hands precisely of this consumerist wave. And my first lesson in psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis was part of this, let's go for the enjoyment, let's do away with the impediments, prohibitions, inhibitions, whatever, frustrations. And my first lesson in psychoanalysis was the Lacanian lesson that jouissance is the impediment. This is the stumbling block. It's not like you can never say, let me enjoy without hindrance. The jouissance itself is the hindrance. This is the obstacle. Is the problem we are stuck with. And in this sense, well, I came to Paris in the heyday of psychoanalysis, but also understood in this rather naive way. But at the same time, this was the year when Lacan had the seminar on the four discourses, so it was also the high point of the reflection on how what are the lessons of 68 the psychoanalysis should draw. What is the nature of the social tie? what is the nature of society we live in. And this Lacanian theory actually brought the uncomfortable answers to this, uncomfortable problematizing of basic assumption of a simply libertarian sort of assumption of let's just give free rein to sexuality.
Right.
And this was part, and I would say that was a magic moment. I mean, the magic moment in the sense that it was a moment of opening, moment of political opening. There was not only 68, there was a whole anti-Vietnam protest. There was after the assassination of Che Guevara, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement in the US. It was the Rudi Dutschke in Germany. So there were huge, massive protests all over the world. We were part of a certain student generation, which, after the affluence after the Second World Second World War period, this was the moment of crisis. This is the moment when the assumptions on which this development of the after-war period was made were put into question. And psychoanalysis was one major element, key element in this. But at the same time, I mean, this structuralism was in full swing. You know, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze published the most important books actually in the few years, 68, 69, 70, 71, Althusser on ideologies, 1970. And on the other hand, there was also the Frankfurt School, because the Frankfurt School, Marcuse in particularly, gave the sort of theoretical background to the student movement. So there were those two things. The French structuralism, which nobody at that time could quite make sense of. And what the hell is this? This huge intellectual revolution, but there was no simple narrative to frame it at the time. So this is the first anecdote. Like me encountering this inscription, "Nous voulons jouir sans entrave," at the age of 18 in Paris, being confronted with this. What is psychoanalysis? Is it about liberation of sexuality, or is it a different kind of discourse?
I mean, on that, before you do the second anecdote, like, to what extent did this question capture the sort of, I don't know, public imagination? Because presumably at this time, the student body, were you there as a student, or what was your...
No, yes, there were other students. There was other students, but also there was a student movement in Ljubljana.
Right.
And this was in 71, and I was very much one of the protagonists of the student movement in Ljubljana, which was a protest movement against the socialism such as it was at the time in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, cool.
And the slogan was May 71 in Ljubljana is like May 68 in Paris.
Right.
We're doing this. No.
Yeah.
It was a global thing. There was a global...
But did you feel that there were two groups, there was a real... Did both sides of this really, this idea that, well, you'd seen these slogans, whatever, thought about these ideas, the idea of liberation of sexuality, following your desire and so on, and then obviously your encounter with psychoanalysis kind of problematized that and allowed you to see that actually there might be some sort of consumerist logic to this way of thinking when actually jouissance is part of it. Was that idea of psychoanalysis really taking hold among these revolutionary student body, or was that quite a small group of people who were thinking of this kind of questioning?
Lacan was both in the eye of the storm in this, and going against the grain of this. I mean, he was both things. And all this reflection was done maybe not in the spot of the enthusiasm of the moment, but like through the 70s. And through the 70s, a group was formed in Ljubljana. Slavoj Žižek was the key element in this. There were several other people attached to the group. Alenka came 15 years later, I mean in the 80s. She's the youngster. The odd one in. So we did a lot of theoretical work in the 70s in Ljubljana. It was just a small group of friends who constantly followed what was going on in Paris, but also with Frankfurt School and other trains of thought which were around. And this brings me to the second anecdote, because by the end of 70s, we somehow all turned Lacanians. I mean, by by reading everyone. No, this was not an exclusive choice in the beginning. It was a choice that emerged. That it seemed that Lacan was the one who goes the furthest in this structuralist revolutionary this thinking.
Mm.
And in '79, by some really lucky strike, I got a scholarship of French government to study in Paris for 1 year. By sheer coincidence. And so I arrived in Paris, this is the second anecdote, in January 1980, to stay there for the rest of the academic year. And I spent the 70s with the idea that there is a big other, and the big other is called École Freudienne de Paris, which was Lacan's school, the school that Lacan established. And the moment I arrived at Paris, the first thing in Le Monde, on the front page of Le Monde, was Lacan has disbanded the school. Like, officially, the big other doesn't exist. You came too late, sorry, there was a big other. But on the day I arrived, actually, this was the day of la dissolution, dissolving the school, the big gesture he made. He was very old at the time. And I was somehow very lucky to attend his last seminar.
Right.
Which was a seminar precisely on dissolution, on dissolving the school, disbanding the school.
Did not know that at all.
Yeah. And so there was this the second moment coming to Paris, and at the moment of greatest glory of Lacan, but also of something we didn't quite realize at the time, which was the beginning of a decline of the whole thing. And one thing I want to talk about is the question of crisis of psychoanalysis, because at the time, when Lacan disbanded his school was so much in the public eye that this was the front page news.
Right.
This was the big front page news.
Yeah.
Like 40 years later, whatever an analyst can do,
Can't get on the front page.
it will go on page 36, maybe in some small note.
Yeah.
And so it just gives a certain perspective on the status of psychoanalysis enjoyed at that time.
I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, it's often mentioned that Lacan himself wasn't, he wasn't, I wouldn't say he wasn't interested in revolutionary politics, but he was also critical of revolutionary politics.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
But actually, you can see that psychoanalysis was much more closely tied to revolutionary politics then than it is now in most cases.
Oh, absolutely. No. In May '68, in the aftermath, it was clear that the two things are closely tied, despite Lacan's, very justified misgivings and criticisms he presented of this. No? So this is one major point I want to make. To start with is the question of the strange fate of psychoanalysis and its universal appeal. Because if you look at Freud, this is really a very, very strange story. The guy in Vienna invents, as it were, a certain new clinical therapeutical approach, a certain technique called psychoanalysis, the talking cure. And this was confined to a rather small circle of people in Vienna, of a certain community. It spread somewhat, but till the Second World War, this was really, we are speaking of very small numbers of people who actually were analysts or who were submitted to psychoanalysis. At the same time, by the time that Freud died, which was in September 1939, just at the beginning of the Second World War, he was the absolute universal reference. Everybody in the world knew about him, in all walks of life, in all different disciplines. He became this discrepancy of a small sort of invention of a certain clinical approach to human psyche, and the spectacular consequences, the spectacular effects this produced on the whole mindset, on the mindset of the 20th century. Yeah. So this I think defines psychoanalysis. That on the one hand, of course, it stems from a certain clinical practice, but on the other hand, it depends on its universal appeal, on it being able to share certain general presuppositions, or the general discourse the framework of a general discourse that is holding the society together. And so many years later, in 1980, when this happened, the Lacan's dissolution of the school, he died a year later, in 1981. The situation was different because the psychoanalysis by then spread all over the world. I mean, it made a huge success in America. Look at Woody Allen movies. I mean, it was universally present in the American sort of mindset of the 70s, the 80s, the afterwar, and but still, Lacan, despite his impossible, enigmatic, very difficult style, he was a universal reference.
Yeah.
He was a universal reference. And this is something that pertains to psychoanalysis, the question of universal address. And what happened in the 40 years after Lacan's death, I think there's a big crisis of psychoanalysis. Because it lost precisely this. It lost quite a lot of this. And this is due to very different factors. I mean, this is due to look at the rise of pharmacology in the past 40 years. I mean, this is staggering. You have a trouble, you have a depression or something, you take a pill, you know, and this is one of the most profitable industries. Psychoanalysis is slow and costly.
Yeah. I mean,
and there is cognitivist therapy. There is a number of the other therapies which compete on the market, which sort of marginalized psychoanalysis relatively. And there are endless internal strives among the psychoanalysts and Lacanians in particular. Who is the true Lacanian? And the sort of trying to promote oneself as the one true Lacanian, the others being traitors. I mean, this has done a lot of damage to psychoanalysis. I mean,
it still goes on.
It still goes on. It still goes on. Sectarianism, the inborn sectarianism, the whole thing, and those people don't know how much damage they're doing to themselves.
Yeah, I think that point about universality, I just got a quick follow up on that, because I think that's really interesting and important. It occurs to me that like it's one of the things that gets lobbied at psychoanalysis as a criticism sometimes, right? Whether that comes from, it could sometimes come from post-colonial thought or feminist thought, that this idea that psychoanalysis is foolishly claiming to speak universally for everyone, but whereas actually it's only, you know, according to some who criticise it, it's, you know, guilty of representing something particular as universal, I suppose, a model of subjectivity or whatever. But actually, I mean, the way you approach that to describe that, it's the other way around, really. It's the quest to be universal is how it can be a means of solidarity, right, for everyone. It's a positive aspect of it rather than a criticism.
Yes, of course. It is also put into question the sort of universality proposed by capitalism. Because psychoanalysis is heir to the Enlightenment. But so is capitalism.
Yeah. No, I mean that's
and so is Karl Marx. I mean, he also saw himself as a heir to the Enlightenment. No? So the legacy of the Enlightenment, this is something we have to struggle with. We have something we have to work with. No? It's a split legacy. It's a split legacy. And if we look at the crisis of psychoanalysis in the past 40 years, it's not just a crisis of psychoanalysis. It's a larger crisis of critical thought, I think. It's a crisis of, you know, Marxism, post-Marxism. What the hell happened to radical thought? What the hell happened to the left?
Yeah, and sort of loss of.
And in 1980, I mean, this was the time I came to Paris, and there was this high day of structuralism in full swing, and Lacan disbanded the school, which made him even a bigger star. You know? I mean, this was also the year when Margaret Thatcher took power in '79, in England, and when Ronald Reagan won the elections in the US. And this is actually, if you take one symbolic year, 1980, was precisely the instauration of neoliberalism. No? So there is the whole neoliberal thing, which in the past 40 years has reshaped the whole landscape in which we operate. And we are in big trouble.
Yeah.
We are in big trouble.
And that kind of universality, would be an ally or a strategy to
absolutely
combat this problem.
I think yeah.
I mean, I want to talk about your more recent work in a bit of detail, but first just one more question on sort of your own history and so on. So you've sort of taken us up to 1980, but with the kind of Slovene school of psychoanalysis, which is, you know, will be well known to everyone who listens to this. You know, when did that? Can you like tell us when that started? And also maybe the questions about Hegel. Like, at what point did you come first to psychoanalysis, and at what point did Hegel then come in as this kind of critical thing, which, you know, the Slovene school is now known for, like this combination of Lacan and Hegel?
Yes, well, I mean, it started in the 70s with this group of people working on structuralism, but at the same time working on the Frankfurt School sort of Marxism, which was a Hegelian Marxism. You know, somehow the struggle for the Hegelian legacy. And our professors at the university were basically sort of Frankfurt School Marxists. I mean, Yugoslavia was a socialist country, but a very special socialist country because it split with Stalin and the whole of the Eastern European type of socialism, and wanted to instigate its own way. And this is why, precisely at the end of 60s and beginning of 70s, it was also internationally, globally, a certain focal point of critical thought. I mean, in Korčula School, I mean, everybody came there. Marcuse came there, Bloch came there, Angela Davis came there. I mean, everybody somehow, there was an idea, at least for some moment, there was a Praxis journal, Praxis International, etc. There was some moment where Yugoslavia actually presented a certain center of the leftist, anti-Stalinist thought, non-Stalinist kind of Marxism. And yes, in the studies of philosophy, we were deeply influenced by this Hegelian and Frankfurt School tradition as well. And there was one puzzle that structuralism saw itself in the majority of cases. I mean, it's not a unitary movement, and the very particular thinkers took very different paths through this. But as a whole, I mean, the idea was around, the structuralism was the anti-Hegelian, I mean, some anti-Hegelian movement, or that structuralism as such is something that gets out of the dialectical cage, and that, in particular, out of the Hegelian cage with the Aufhebung as the sort of suppression of all heterogeneity, etc., the ability to abolish, suppress, into a movement which ultimately runs into identity, as it were, or the absolute. And Hegel, for most of the structuralists, was seen as an adversary, as a paradigmatic enemy, actually. Enemy. We are structuralists against the Hegelian thought. And Lacan was slightly different in this, because he was Kojève's pupil. And he always had this enormous respect for Kojève and for Hegel. And he tried to work with Hegel, and actually, in spite of the fact that he also saw a deeply problematic side of Hegel, he nevertheless tried to work with Hegel.
That's okay, we're all just checking it's working. We're all good.
It's working. So Lacan was different. I mean, he thought that there is a Hegelian legacy we have to assume, and of course critically assume and turn it around. I mean, not just accepting it. But the trouble with this, the way we saw it, the trouble with this Lacan's take was that his take on Hegel is completely framed by Kojève. He never has an independent take on Hegel. And we thought that another take on Hegel, different kind of take on Hegel, actually comes much closer to what Lacan is doing than Lacan's own take on Hegel.
Okay.
Yeah. That Kojève is actually an impediment, rather, in understanding of what is at stake in the Hegelian dialectics. And this is the different kind of Hegel that emerges there. And we sort of thought that there was a false battle, structuralism versus Hegel. That what the conceptually what is at stake, the stakes are actually very close, and that one profits conceptually from bringing those stakes together
Mm-hmm.
and as a sort of common battle.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, the Kojève Hegel influences Lacan to read it in a particular way, and the Slovene school kind of cuts Kojève out of that loop and produces this kind of a different Hegel, which is more like the Hegel Marx read.
Hegel Marx?
The one that Hegel the Hegel that Marx read. Or,
yes, well, Marx's own references to Hegel are again profoundly split.
Right.
You know? He started off as a Hegelian, but then all his early writings are, the criticism of Hegel, and he went for Feuerbach in a certain moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's only the Capital that he actually adopts a very Hegelian structure of thought in his approach.
I mean, it's incredible how much people's... I think even in the last 10, 15 years... I mean, I remember... I mean, different people teach it in different ways, but I think that when I first was taught Hegel at university, he was still being used as this kind of straw man which structuralism took down. But now, most people's instinct is to think of the more Slovene school version of Hegel and think about dialectics.
I hope we had some success with
it really has changed the whole...
No, because Hegel was, he was seen just as a monstrosity. If you look at someone like Deleuze, and I appreciate Deleuze, I really appreciate Deleuze. I mean, I'm profoundly interested in anti-Hegelians if they are doing their job properly. But I mean, in Deleuze, Hegel functions absolutely as a straw man. He never quotes Hegel. I mean, he's Deleuze as opposed to this black devil who is supposed to be dialectics and Hegel, etc. But he never ever quotes. I mean, there's a single quote in Différence et Répétition, I think, somehow. But I mean, wherever he mentions Hegel, this is just as an opponent as such. This is against which we have to do philosophy nowadays.
Well, I mean, let's carry on talking about philosophy nowadays, but I wanted to ask about some of the couple of recent things. There's something of your recent work's been about the question of authority and thinking about what authority is today, and then another really interesting, I think it's a chapter as well, a chapter on gossip and rumour that you've written, as well as talks about it, about, and this is very much turning towards thinking about how politics functions today, and the digital world and the contemporary world, and thinking about modernity and what it is. I mean, they're both in a sense about authority in different forms. But with the sort of broader question, the question of authority today, I mean, one of the things you've said recently is that you've got, I think it's from Hannah Arendt, there's religion, tradition, and authority. They're her categories, aren't they, of like three kind of pillars of a social state. And you've been talking about how the way you see it, religion and tradition have kind of receded significantly, but we've got a bigger problem than ever with authority. So take us through that kind of argument and why you think this is important for today.
I mean, Hannah Arendt, she has this famous paper, which is from the 50s, I think, on what is authority. And she starts off this paper, I mean, at the very beginning, saying the question is not what is authority, but what was authority. Because authority has gone from the modern world. This is her entry line. No? This is how she enters the problem of authority. No?
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And so authority has gone from the modern world. I mean, there's something that defines modernity, that we don't have any reliance in the authority of the big other, as it were. And an authority of the big other, which was underpinned by whatever, transcendence, religion, by the power ascribed to kings, monarchs, the people in power, whatever. I mean, this power is gone. So what defines the modern world is the downfall of authority. There's no background on which we can base authority. Now, the interesting thing is that the moment one speaks about authority, one speaks about the crisis of authority.
Yeah.
It was never any different. If you look back at Plato, I mean, his problem is also once there was a proper authority.
Yes. Yeah.
Now the authority is gone. We have to re-establish it. Now, so authority is one of those things which about which one can speak only in the past tense, as it were. Once there was authority. But we live in a time of degradation of authority. Things have been falling apart. No? So you always presuppose some mythical past that one has to recuperate, recapture, in order to do the proper authority thing. And this is something which is, I think, coterminous with the speech about authority. Any speech about authority always starts from the crisis of authority. No? But what Hannah Arendt says is basically that there has been crisis of this crisis with modernity.
Okay.
That even that argument now doesn't work any longer. It doesn't work any longer.
Yes.
So we are stuck with the impossibility of authority, which has to do with the status of the big other. I mean, there was in the pre-modern times the status of the big other based on transcendence, let's say, which could underpin authority, and the authority of the master. And what modernity did was to implement another kind of big other, which is the big other of knowledge and big other of science, scientific progress. This is what Lacan calls university discourse, where knowledge precisely is in the place of the agent of this discourse. And so modernity is supposed to have done away with any unfounded authority, and has done away with the master, with the very figure of the master. Because the very figure of the master was unfounded, was founded only on the supposition of a transcendent guarantee, as it were. So this guarantee is gone. So we have the downfall of the master, we have the downfall of the father. This is how authority can be defined. In the name of knowledge, enlightenment, progress, argument, anybody who is to assume some position of authority can only do so on the basis of knowledge, on the basis of expertise, on the basis of know-how. So on the basis of reason, an argument. There's the authority of reason, which will supplant any other kind of authority. And now the problem arises. The problem arises that the modernity, which is supposed to have done away with the figure of the master, with this irrationally founded, non-founded authority, has itself produced the new ways of domination. And this was already Freud's problem. This was already Freud's problem. And I think Freud is sometimes taken as someone who still relies on the name of the father and the authority of the father, etc., as the formative factor. And Deleuze's, for instance, Deleuze-Guattari criticism he wants to reduce the question of power to the familial constellation of the father, etc., etc. But I think that Freud's problem is actually quite different. It's what happens with the downfall of the father. I mean, the fathers have lost their
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean,
authority. The symbolic law has lost its authority. What happens afterwards? Why do we have this problem? I mean, when modernity is supposed to have done away with the problem of mastery in this classical, non-founded master, charismatic figure, something. And I think that Freud's problem can be perhaps best encapsulated in this very short slogan, that the dead father has died. That what installed the authority of the father was the body of the father in the hoard, etc., etc., all these myths. No? So the dead father could install the symbolic relevance of the law, you know, the sway of the law, the way that the law can hold as a symbolic law. And now the dead father has lost that ability. The dead father himself has died. So the symbolic law has lost this sway. And you have this new, in its place, you have these new figures of the masters, which are far more insidious in some way, and far more difficult to deal with. And if I tell another anecdote, which is a true anecdote, I mean, which links Freud to Slovenia. And Freud was our compatriot for most of his life, because this used to be part of Austria-Hungary. He lived in the same state as we do. for 16 more years of his life. So he made trips also through Slovenia, and on one memorable occasion, which was at Easter 1898, he stopped to visit a cave, because Slovenia is very famous for some really wonderful caves. I mean, some of the best caves you can see in the world are in Slovenia. The one thing we're very good at is the caves.
I never get out of this small city centre.
No, go see the caves. Go see the caves. I mean, they're really spectacular. They're really spectacular.
Yeah.
And so Freud was taken to this cave. I mean, guided by a Slovene guide. Okay, I won't tell the long version of the story. I mean, every element is very funny, but somehow he describes this in the letter to William Flies, and he describes it as a descent into inferno. There's the Scotian cave, one of the most famous caves, had this structure of a descent into abyss. And he says Dante wouldn't need any other inspiration for his Inferno if he saw this. And indeed, I mean, with some caves in Slovenia, there's many caves in this. There are many caves in this part of the world.
What's going on in there? People eating their own children in there or something?
No. In sort of half a dozen of these caves, they say Dante was here and so he saw this cave, and this is where he got the inspiration for the Inferno. So Freud describes this as a descent into Slovene hell. And now comes a really astounding part of this story, because this was Easter time, and people from Vienna were on holidays and were visiting the outskirts of the country. Mm-hmm. And so whom does he meet in the bottom of the Slovene Inferno? Dr. Karl Vega. And Dr. Karl Vega was at the time the Burgomaster of Vienna, and Vega became the Burgomaster on the anti-Semitic ticket.
Right.
And the first thing to know is that the Emperor, Franz Joseph, refused to appoint him because he saw him as a populist. And populism was the word which exactly stems from that time.
Right.
He was labeled populist at that time. And you can see with this Franz Joseph refusing to appoint him 4 times, although he won the election.
Right.
You can see the old father figure, Emperor Franz Joseph,
Blocking
you can see, Franz Joseph is whatever, the moustache, etc. Actually, being confronted with this new populist upstart, and trying to prevent his ascent, but he had to give in to the democratic will of the masses. This is the first interesting thing, and the second thing is that the very young Hitler was roaming the streets of Vienna, and he had one big ego ideal, and that was Dr. Karl Vega. So in Mein Kampf, I mean, Hitler describes his own development to anti-Semitism as being completely overseen by Vega. I mean, he says, everything I learned about anti-Semitic propaganda, I learned from Vega. So you can see with this confrontation of Freud and Vega in 98, at the beginning of the century, inaugurating the century. I mean, this is an image which really deserves to be some iconic image of the 20th century. You have this Jew, this arch-Jew, this godless Jew, Freud, confronting the person who literally stood at the origin of fascism. Literally. I mean, not... you have... And I think the psychoanalysis started precisely in this constellation. I think this anecdote is important because it has some sort of... It's a kind of allegory. It's being confronted with a new type of the master which emerged as a consequence after the victory of the Enlightenment. It's the revenge on the victory of the Enlightenment, that this person could emerge and gain his status.
It's a perfect anecdote to show that, the quote from Freud, the dead father is dead, which is, I suppose you're saying that's kind of an equivalent between that and Arendt's phrase, the crisis of authority, right? What's happening is there was always, the father's always dead, but there's another kind of step in this history where the dead father's dead, and that then produces a much more insidious kind of structure of society or whatever. And then, you know, you mentioned populism there. In your other recent talk, you sort of playfully said that Trump is the great Lacanian, like the perfect Lacanian, but precisely because it's the without this big other. Right? So, am I reading that right? This is also like contemporary politician populism today.
I think this anecdote, I mean, is somehow perfect in order to initiate the fate of psychoanalysis in present time. Mm-hmm. It's like structurally we have the same problem. No? Mm-hmm. The problem Freud encountered kind of contingently in Slovene hell, in Slovene underground, and it was the only time they met.
Yeah.
I mean, these were two persons who would never come face to face in Vienna. Not possibly.
Yeah.
And so he had to go to this descent into inferno to meet this person. I mean,
but what I mean is, do you think? I mean, maybe Trump's not the ideal example, but one of many, maybe. But do you think we are seeing the kind of insidious leader figures or structures in society today, which are, you know, still following on from this?
Yes. I think that structurally it follows from the same constellation. Mm-hmm. Structurally, it follows from the same constellation, and. What happens today? I mean, what is insidious, particularly with figures like Trump and several others. I mean, and there will be. I'm afraid there will be more.
Yeah, for sure.
Look at the elections in Italy. I mean, for the next month.
Yeah. In a sense, it's silly to talk about Trump because it's a structural issue, not her.
It's a structural issue. Yeah, and yes, I think what is insidious about Trump is the amount of cynicism where. You don't even need to conceal anything. You don't need to conceal what your agenda is. I mean, the classical critique of ideology tried to disentangle what is concealed under the universality, under the alleged universality of ideological claims. But here you have a man who, I mean, I think the best image of Trump is like. Before you had to say, look at the emperor, he's really naked.
Yeah.
But then Trump comes up and say, look, I'm naked.
I see.
You have all the time, you have this, he doesn't conceal anything.
Yeah.
There's no veil to be lifted in order to see what is behind this, which is just this crude interest which he states in plain letters.
Yeah.
And there's no concealment in this. And actually, my friend Yuval Kremitsa, he wrote this wonderful piece which is called "The Emperor's New Nudity." and I think this is the new nudity. This is the problem we are facing. But what do we see when this veil is lifted? And this is very cynical kind of thing that you don't even conceal what your particular interest is. What do we see? Do we see truth? But not at all. I mean, this is how. This is not lifting of repression. This is heightening of repression. This is the repression itself gets repressed. So there's more repression in this. Look at me, I'm naked.
I mean,
there's no veil.
In a way, that goes back to the original thing we were saying with this. Situationist statements of liberation and freedom and so on, you know, the idea of, you know, being completely unveiled is actually more oppressed than being just repressed.
Yes,
as it were.
Yes. So there's a new type of repression, a new type of master. A completely cynical master where there is nothing hidden behind this. No, there's somehow all the weapons, the conceptual instruments of critical theory. We're somehow powerless against Trump. No?
Well, that brings me on to this question of rumour before we sort of run out of time, because I also think this is one of the really interesting things you've been writing about the present moment today. And of course, it's interesting that Trump seems to be immune to rumour and gossip in a way that other people perhaps aren't. But I mean, one of the things you've been sort of saying, writing, is that you know, this is in a sense, this is a kind of a new age of rumour and gossip, and in a sense, I think you're saying that there's a kind of we've got a decline of the big other, we've got decline of traditional authorities, as we've talked about here, decline of patriarchal structures and so on that's happened, but we do have this other master or other big other. I think you called it the big other and its double,
Yeah.
right? And the double of the big other, the other side of the big other, is something like rumour and gossip. Right? And in a sense, obviously, we are this society obsessed with endless rumour, and the rumour has become, I suppose, actually, it goes back to what you were saying just a bit ago about the question of knowledge, right? Because you know, one of the things you said that's really interesting is that we've now got this levelling out of knowledge and opinion. I mean, it's so true. If you just look at a newspaper, like a British newspaper like The Guardian, you know, there's no difference really between a factual story and an op-ed piece or whatever. Questions about fake news and so on. So, you know, I mean, just say what your sort of, why you think rumour and gossip are important terms for understanding the present moment, and what's happening with this kind of levelling out of knowledge and opinion into this kind of situation.
Well, it's I've been doing some work on this, and this is a story which goes back actually to the very origins of philosophy. I mean, even if you look at Socrates, and I start this reflection with Socrates, I mean, he's the man who established knowledge as the standard against any opinions. I mean, he's the man who established episteme against doxa as the beginning of philosophy. You have to pursue the true knowledge. This is the mission of philosophy. But he was undone by rumors. And he says so in his apology. If there was an opponent against whom I can argue, that would be easy. But
it's just rumour.
But they're just rumors. I mean, these are anonymous rumors were circulated, which are completely untrue. But it's like fighting shadows, he says. I can't argue against anyone because the rumors framed him. The rumors brought him to this trial, and he lost against rumors. I mean, the man who was allegedly the wisest man ever, according to the Delphi oracle. And even this man, with all his wisdom and with all his foundational act of philosophy, and he was helpless against rumors. I mean, the shadows won. I mean, he was fighting the shadows, but the shadows won. So this is why already at the beginning of philosophy you can see the big other and its double. Socrates trying to establish the big other of logos as the measure, the foundation of true knowledge. And then you have this shadowy big other, you know, there's this double big other, you know, which is just circulating somehow, like the breeze in the air. And
it's interesting that universities are the hotbed of rumour, the ultimate hotbed of rumour, aren't they?
No,
they're
yes,
also the logos.
well, and I think this history starts already there, you know, the sort of the logos and the sort of the inability of logos to fight its other, to fight this shadowy other, unfounded. No, it's unfounded. Everybody may know this is not true, rumors, but they still work. And they're very efficient. They stick. They stick. Audacter calumniare semper aliquid heret. This is the Latin adage. No? You just slander boldly because something will always stick. Something will always stick. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. No, this is the sort of strategy. And then I think this, I don't have time to go into this. There are several stages one can describe how this big other and its double work. And I think that in the 20th century, you had the first problem of the shadowy big other was the mediatization of society, which started with the mass press, the yellow press, etc., already in the 19th century, and continued with television, massively with television, and then actually reached its apex with social media, which are where it's completely impossible to tell apart rumors from knowledge, rumors from opinion, and there's like a collapse of the dividing lines between private and public. Because what are the social media? Is this private? No, but governments use it to. This is privately owned platforms.
It is private in a sense.
Privately used platforms with completely untransparent algorithms. But everybody, somehow, the governments use it to convey all kinds of publicly important things. Everybody uses it as the line between public and private is impossible to establish because, I mean, somehow naively, one would imagine public is the big other and private is what is not. Somehow just confined to limited or whatever usage. Whereas what is public is addressed to the big other. It has to stand up on or against the background of the big other. It has to be based on some sort of logos, reason, the authority of reason, ultimately. And this first, the dividing line between public and private is completely collapsed. And also the dividing line between knowledge and opinion, and the dividing line between what is verified and what is not, and the dividing line what is relevant and what is not, and the dividing line between the obscene and the acceptable.
The acceptable, yeah. And I mean, it's interesting also that, and connected to that is what you say, that the rumour, you'd think, because when I started reading the thing about rumour, I was expecting it's kind of anti-authority, right? So rumour takes down Socrates, or it's an example, people in authority get brought down by rumours. But really what you're saying is that this culture of rumour and gossip, it has an authority that's actually precisely by having no author. It sort of circulates powerfully as an idea, and it has almost a kind of force of its own, and it carries with it an authority that's a different structure of authority to traditional ones.
Yes.
And it operates in a world like you just described, where these divisions between things are no longer relevant because it functions. This functions as today's authority, right?
Yes, and I think social media is really taking this to a new level. It's taking this to a new level because the Facebook, Instagram, those things. Facebook is like 15 years. I mean, it's 2005. I think it started. 17 years maybe.
Yeah.
Instagram is 2010. YouTube is 2005.
2005. Yeah.
It's like 15 years. I mean,
it's quite short.
It's completely taken over in a space of a decade. It's completely taken over as the medium of the public and private social exchange. And there's a big difference with television. I mean, we were very worried. I mean, in the time of my youth, or the 80s or the 90s, I mean, there was a huge problem with the mediatization of society through television. That you don't have access to somehow. The television is the only reality. It mediates any access to reality that you can have. But television still ultimately absolutely depends on the division between public and private, because some people are on television and the vast majority watches them. As very few can be on television. Whereas everybody is on internet, everybody is on social media. No, the dividing line between the producer and consumer is completely collapsed. Everybody participates in this. Somehow, so there is the real, in some sense, the downfall of the big other, the downfall of this big other of logos, or of reason, which should be the space of public reason, the free use of free use of public reason. This was Kant's formula. Just allow us this. If reason can be given freedom of public use, then we will win in the long run. The reason we will get the upper hand, if only it's allowed the free public use. And this has collapsed. This idea, this naive idea, has somehow collapsed. And yes, you were asking this in the beginning. I mean, does this mean the decline of the big other? I'm afraid things are much worse. I mean, it's not simply decline of the big other, but somehow the installation of another big other, which is more insidious, which can't be touched, which we can't really undo, or we cannot intervene into it.
I mean, I think that's
the more we can intervene in the space of the social media, whatever. I mean, the more untouchable
it becomes. Yeah. I think that's right. I mean,
and I think also. I've recently seen this French movie, The Lost Illusions.
I haven't seen it.
It was made for a lot of money. It's sort of glamorous. It was last year's French entry for Oscar, and it's interesting because it's based on Balzac's novel, and this is 1830s, and this guy comes to Paris, Lucien de Rubempré, and he makes a big career in the press, in the mass press, the journals being published then. And this was the moment when this massive presence of press was possible because of the general literacy, in the 19th century, and because of the it was the first time that it was technically possible to produce such masses of newspapers every day. You know? And you can see in 1835 Paris, what you can see. Fake news, denigration, scandal mongering, on a huge scale. So film is somehow consciously made as a sort of a kind of mirror of our society. If you think we're in trouble, I mean, people thought they were in deep trouble in 1835 in Paris, with the advent of this mass press, and the complete yellow. I mean, there were no regulations and putting some limits to this. When this emerged, this mass phenomenon, and people just, people's fates were ruined just by these campaigns or whatever. I mean, by lying shamelessly. So where has this started? The downfall of the big other. You already with the press in 1830s. Absurdly, you have already this problem. This is the post-truth era. Actually, the people see it as the post-truth era. What has happened to the victory of the Enlightenment? This is the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, there's also this, that maybe the decline of Logos is as old as Logos itself. But this doesn't mean that Logos has been on the decline.
In this way,
but there have been major cuts in this history, major breaks in this history, and I think we are living in this past 15 years also with this social media and the new turn that neoliberalism is taking.
Yeah,
that we are living in a certain shift in an extremely dangerous era.
Yeah, and I mean, just as a very last thing, I mean, your sort of position that in the way we've done in this conversation, the role of psychoanalysis here is to help us understand this history and these changes that are taking place, or you also think psychoanalysis has still a revolutionary politics role to play in combating this situation, or it's more about using it to understand?
Well, you have the famous thesis 11 by Marx, which says philosophers have only interpreted the world, and the point is, however, to change it. No? And I always thought that this was a false dilemma. That you can't change the world without interpreting it. And you have to is psychoanalysis there merely to make us understand the situation? But make us understand the situation means intervening in the situation.
It's an intervention itself. Yeah.
It's already an intervention. Yeah. It already is the beginning of an intervention. And I always thought that psychoanalysis has this. It's not. There is no immediate politics of psychoanalysis, but the way it addresses the social problems actually opens them up and enables a certain radical politics, non-naive radical politics, let's say.
Yeah, and a universal one.
And a universal one, absolutely. The new invention of the universal.
Yeah, that's what's needed, isn't it? And
absolutely.
The opposite. It goes to the social media thing, and because that's. Presenting itself falsely as this universal platform.
It's useful. It's useful to distinguish global and universal.
Yeah.
I mean, capitalism has become global. It's not therefore universal. Social media have become global, but they're not universal. I mean, they lack the stamp of the big other. They lack this. The universality of reason. And I know the universality of reason is a highly problematic thing, but it's a thing which has to be reinvented. Constantly reinvented.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. I mean, we've covered a whole history of everything.
Short history of everything.
Short history of everything in an hour. But no, it's really good. Thanks for doing it.
Well, thank you, Alfie, for having me.